Hi, Carol Schrading here, VP of Programs with Mountain Brook Art Association. Today we're in for a real treat. You're going to get a demonstration and conversation with artist Alisa Koch. She's from Montgomery, and last week I got to visit her in her beautiful home and studio and watch her paint. Alisa is a wonderful palette knife specialist. Her works are incredibly identifiable, and she's a great teacher. So if you like Alisa's work and her teaching style, then please check out her Facebook page, her Instagram account, or look for her Zoom classes. So Mountain Brook Art Association brings you Alisa Koch. Please enjoy the demo and know that we are all one community trying to get through a tough time and make great art.
Hey everyone, I'm Alisa Koch and I'm here in my home studio in Montgomery, Alabama. Carol was nice enough to give me a call and ask me to share some of my tips and tricks for painting. I'm an oil painter primarily, and I use palette knives. I'm sure most of you have used these from time to time. I use a Liquitex Freestyle number 13 mostly, and that's what I've become known for, is my palette knife painting. And so today I might share some of those techniques with you guys, so if you'll hang around I'll be happy to share those. Here behind me in this painting is the Edmund Pettus Bridge. A.C. Reeves out of Selma, Alabama. She takes daily photos of the Edmund Pettus Bridge on her walks. And she takes them at night, during the morning, you know, all times of day, and she's a really good friend, and she was nice enough to share her photos with me so that I could paint from them. So I want you to remember that if you ever use anybody's photos, that you always ask permission before you paint from them. That's very, very important. Photographers are artists also, and they prize their artwork. So she shared several of her photos with me. I did some workshops over in her studio, and we have, before coronavirus, we were trying to amp up tourism over in Selma. And because I'm in Montgomery, you know, there's a deep connection between the two cities. And so we were trying to find ways to connect the two and connect tourism. And so I wanted to start with the bridge mainly because that is kind of where the story began. And as you all are familiar, John Lewis just passed away recently, and so it's been a nice time to honor that tradition and that memory and those people that fought for civil rights. So started out with some of her photographs, and that's what I did here. And this is a really difficult color. If any of you guys have ever used Winsor Newton's blue-green shade, it's like a phthalo blue and a very tricky color. You know, it's not very tameable, that I might say. So here I used it here in the background area, but I also used it a lot in the foreground area. So you have to know how to create those cooler hues, but then bring it forward and create those warmer hues so that you get that depth perception. And I teach a lot of color theory workshops and palette knife workshops, and in those a lot of people struggle with color, and you know, I always tell them to start with just the basic palette, a very limited palette, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I start to paint. But all you need is a red, a yellow, and a blue, believe it or not. And then I always use something to what I call neutralize my palette, and that just kind of tames all the colors down. It also desaturates them because you don't want to have saturated colors in all of your painting. So here we have more saturated colors, but then we have more desaturated colors here in the outer edges. And so it's not just about value, and it's not just about temperature. It's all of these things together that will help create depth. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we start to do the painting. Thank you. All right, everybody. What I want to talk about is this photograph right here. This is actually out in my front yard, and I take photos of it quite often because I'm always trying to capture the clouds. And I've painted this a couple of different times, and it's really popular with people because it's just such an odd object to be painting. But as you can see here, I took another photograph of it, and the clouds were just beautiful. I just loved those. So part of my process is I usually do some color studies, and this is what my color studies look like. Doesn't look like much, does it? But basically, I'm just trying to figure out what kind of colors I want to use in my finished product. So in this one here, I don't have an underpainting, and as you can see, there is white coming up underneath. Oh, and let me back up. This is a wonderful product. This is oil paper. If you guys have never used oil paper, this is definitely something that you want to try and explore, because it is very economical and very forgiving. Let me find the front of one. Well, I'm sorry, I don't have one handy, but I can tell you that Alabama Art Supply in Birmingham does have it, and they have it in different sizes. Different sizes as in 9 by 12 and 12 by 16, and then even larger sheets that they can cut down into any size for you. And that's why I like this product, because as you see, there's no saturation on the back. So these are all oil paints. I painted them just like I would a canvas. And the fibers in here are really interweaved, and they work much like a watercolor paper, but you don't have to gesso this. As an oil painter, we've used a lot of products before to get a surface preparation, and in this one you don't have to. It's ready to paint. So in this second one, I have an underpainting, and that's my favorite color. It is transparent red ochre, and if you've ever seen any of my paintings, you'll know that that's kind of my signature color, and that's this tube of color, Winsor & Newton transparent red ochre. Pretty economical as well. I think they're like $12 or $13 a tube. And when I don't want to use that one, I'll use a different one, and that's Williamsburg Italian Pink. And I like Williamsburg because their paints actually have beeswax in them, which is kind of cool, especially if you're going to be using the product we'll use in a little bit. But this is the transparent red ochre, as you can see here. It's a very orangey hue, but as in its term, the transparent, it layers very nicely. So when you're using it, you can actually get those nice values set here. So what I did here was I did the underpainting in that transparent red ochre. And what happens here is you can layer it till it gets really dark. So this is the lighter version, and then it goes up into the darker version. And I'll do a quick demo of that in just a moment. So then back to the card, here I used a different underpainting color, I think maybe yellow ochre, and then in this one I used the combination of transparent red ochre and red, because I kind of liked a little bit more pop there. But then you can decide which underpainting is going to work for you best. And as you see, no underpainting is just kind of bleh, you know, it doesn't really have any interest. And then with the yellow, it's kind of interesting, it warms things up. But then with these oranges and reds, it really just makes things pop. And the reason is because you're using cooler colors. I have a lot of cool in here, and I need something to balance, so I want to use some more warmth. So when you're thinking about your underpainting and you're thinking about those colors, think about what is the predominant color in your photograph. So like today, in our photograph here, we have a lot of blue. Now I don't want to paint a monochromatic blue painting with just white clouds. So I'm going to mix up some colors that are going to make this photograph a little bit more interesting. Now I did take this photograph and manipulate it in an app called Snapseed. And Snapseed is free, and you can download it from the App Store. I'm sure they probably have it for Android also, but it is a free app, and you can go on there and you can manipulate your photos and do all kinds of fun things. And this one was called Vintage, I believe is the term that this filter was called, and all that is just a filter. Okay, so I'm going to put that there. Now I want to talk about my palette a little bit. When I was talking about a limited palette earlier, I was talking about blue, yellow, red, my neutralizer, and white. Now as you see here, I have two other colors on my palette, and the reason is because I'm going to try to figure out which yellow is going to work best with my blue in order to get the colors that I want in this photograph here. So if you have a piece of scrap board or a piece of oil paper handy, you can mix up these colors and then you can put them on here and decide what's going to work best for you. Okay, I'm back with my oil paper, and this is what it looks like. It's arches and it says oil or oleo, and this is 12 sheets in here, and you can cut them down to any size, which is great. So I've used all of this one, but I have one left, and that's here. So I could cut this down to size, but just for today, I'm just gonna lay it here so you guys can see me using it. Now you do want to tape it down. And what I like to do is I like to give it a little bit of a frame so that when you take off the tape, you have a little bit of a border on there, just like you do in a photograph, you know, or just like you would a painting. It kind of gives you a different vantage point. All right, so I'm taping this down. And you don't have to paint over the entire surface. You can cut it up into 4 little squares. So if I wanted to just shorten this a little bit, I could do that. And why don't we just go ahead and cut it down to here, because I'm going to try to mix up some colors that I think might be useful for my painting. Alright, so the colors I have here is Winsor Blue Green Shade, and it's by Winsor & Newton. And then I have Gamblin's 1980 here. That's Hansa Yellow Light. And then I have this Lemon Hue. This is Winsor & Newton's Lemon Yellow Hue. Now the reason I pulled this one out is because these colors are really, really cool. And if you look here, this is a really warm color. This is the Hansa Yellow Light. And if I look at my photo, I don't feel like there's really much warmth to it, but I might actually like the warmer color. So I'm going to try both of them. And then this is a cool yellow. If you can see that here. That's the Lemon Yellow Hue. So I want to see how those two colors interact with the green, the Winsor Blue Green Shade, to see what kind of greens I get also. And then here I have Williamsburg Cadmium Red Medium. And then here I have the Williamsburg Italian Pink, or I have the Transparent Red Ochre. And then I have Soft Mixing White here. Now I use Soft Mixing White because I use a palette knife. You can certainly use titanium, and then you can add any mediums to it. And when you add other mediums to it, it will actually give it better flow. So when you're using a palette knife, you don't have all these stiff oil paints that you're trying to loosen up. All right, so I'm gonna put my photo there so you guys can see it. But I can take this Hansa Yellow and this Winsor Blue Green Shade and mix the two together. And as you can see, it creates a really wonderful green. It's a little Kelly green. It's a little too vibrant, I think, in my opinion, for any greens, but you may like that. So I'm going to put a little green down here, and actually I'm going to move this way. I'll turn it vertical like my photograph. Okay, so let's look at that here in a more portrait style. All right, so I can take my green and spread it across here, and you can see what that green actually looks like. It's probably pretty dark on your screen, so you'll have to experiment with it at home to see what it looks like. But you can also add a little bit of white, and it'll lighten it up. And then you can add a little bit of the neutralizer. So we're going to take the Transparent Red Ochre, and that will darken it. So it acts like a red, right? It acts like a complement. So if you need a darker color, then that's what you can do to achieve that. I don't usually use black on my palette. No blacks. I create all my darks out of just a limited palette. All right, so there we have some varied greens, which, like I said, they're probably hard to see on your screen right now. but at least I can see what that yellow, is going to do with that green. So I'm going to move that out of the way, and then I'm going to take the Winsor blue-green shade and add this other yellow to it, which is the lemon yellow hue. Now, I already know that I'm using a cool blue and I'm using a cool yellow, so I'm going to have a pretty cool green. And I'm talking about in temperature-wise. So when I mix this lemon yellow hue, and if I hold it up next to this other green, you can see that it is a lot cooler in color. I'm going to add a little bit of white so you guys can see that better on your screen. And this is just something good for you to experiment with, so that you understand mixing color and you understand your color palette. There we have a much cooler color there. So you can see the difference between that and that, even in the camera, hopefully. All right, so let's look at our photograph. Now, how am I going to decide which yellow I want to use? Well, I want to see which color I'm going to use predominantly. So the next thing I want to do is I'm moving that green out of my white, because as you know, it can taint everything. And right now I want more of a pure yellow, just so that I can see how it's going to react in my painting. So I'm cleaning off my palette knife. I have some paper towels set aside over here, so I'm just wiping it down as I go. All right, so I'm going to take some of this white and I'm going to add some of the light yellow to it. And it is pretty lemony yellow. So I'm going to lay some of that on my card here. And then I'm going to take some of this other yellow, which is a warmer yellow, and I'm going to add it to white. And I'm going to lay it on my card also. Now, I do tend to like this warmer yellow, and some of you that are a little bit more experienced might say, well, you really need both. And yes, that is true. You could use both colors in your painting. You could use a double primary palette, which is warm hues and cool hues. But for the purposes of this, I'm trying to decide what's going to simplify my palette and what's going to be easier for me to paint with. And if I'm strict about my limited palette, then I don't get confused about how to mix green or how to mix something cooler or warmer, or how to mix some oranges or anything else like that. I'm only going to use those limited colors, okay? All right, so the next thing I want to do is try a little bit of the red. And as you guys know, red is pretty potent, so I just want a little dab there on my palette. And I want to add a little bit of the yellow to see how that yellow is going to interact with that red. And I want to put some of it on my palette also. And I might just lighten it up a little bit so it'll give it more of a peachy color. So I'm going to lay it in between these two colors right here. And that way, and see, I already contaminated my color there. All right, get a little bit more red and a little bit more yellow. So all I'm trying to do is just get some relationships going. You know, when you're in a relationship, you like to touch, so colors like to touch also, and that's how you can determine what is going to be the better color for you. All right, now I'm going to take a cool yellow and white and a little bit of the red and see how that orange is shaping up. And honestly, I don't think there's going to be much of a difference, because this red is going to warm up that yellow a little bit. I added a little bit more white to this one, so it's a little bit lighter than the other one. But honestly, there's not much of a difference between the two. So really my question is going to be, what's going to be better for me? Is this green, this lighter green, going to be better, the cooler, or the warmer? And honestly, I think because of all of this blue that's going on in here and some of these cooler yellows that are happening here, I think that I'm going to want to go with a warmer yellow. So I'm going to eliminate this cool hue out of my palette. My trash can moved. Okay, so that's what happens when you clean the studio, right? All right, so now I'm going to take my yellow and I'm going to move it over here because that's the one I want to use. Now I need to decide what is my underpainting color going to be. So typically what I want to do is I want to create another color swatch so that I can do this all over again. For today, I'm just going to put these colors out side by side so that you can see the differences in them. One is definitely darker than the other. The Italian pink, as you see here, is much browner. And this one has a much oranger and red hue. So what happens is when you start to paint with it, it doesn't allow for as much transparency. But I wanted something for you guys to see some comparisons. The other thing I want to say is that the transparent red ochre, this one here, does not get as dark as that Italian pink. If you want to darken the transparent red ochre, you could always add a little bit of the blue to it, some of that Winsor blue-green shade, and that'll give you a darker value. So this one is the transparent red ochre, and what I'm doing is I'm thinning it down with just odorless mineral spirits. And as you can see, it's pretty orange on this oil paper. If you're going to use the oil paper, just remember that it does absorb pretty quickly. So you have to work in thinner, quicker layers when you use the paper. You will not be able to remove much of it. So if you're an artist that likes to subtract paint as you're working, I like to do that a lot, then you're not going to be able to do that on the paper as much because it is so absorbent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of this transparent red ochre and layer that on top so that you can see how dark it'll get. Okay, so there, and it's still pretty orange. All right, now I'm going to take the Italian pink by Williamsburg. I really like this color. It's a much more sophisticated color. If you are a painter that paints more natural colors, and what I mean by that is more true to life, then you're probably going to like the Italian pink a whole lot more. I like it for when I'm doing something a little bit, what I call my more serious painting, something that's not quite as pop art, you know, not trying to please the crowds. So I'm going to take this Italian pink and I'm going to thin it down. And I'm going to lay it right next to this one so you guys can see the difference. And as you see here, it's much more brown and it's very close in value to this. So you can't get it as light as that transparent red ochre. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a paper towel and just try to smooth some of that out a little bit. It's smoothed pretty nicely on the paper, but you have to be careful. I would definitely say practice on the paper a few times. It takes a certain subtlety to use it. And then I'm going to take some more of that Italian pink and I'm going to lay a darker layer down so that you guys can see how dark it'll get. And as you see, there's a huge difference between this color and this color. All right. So as far as deciding which color to go with this palette, I'm going to choose to go with this one. And the reason being is because I feel like this is not a true to nature photograph because I filtered it with a very cool and vintage look. And so I want to try to keep true to the photograph. Now I wouldn't recommend that always. You have to decide what you want to do first. But I do like that transparent red ochre with this palette that I've got here. Okay, so we'll be back in just a few minutes and we'll talk about how to start the painting process. Okay, so we're back. We're going to talk a little bit about the underpainting and I'm going to show you how I do that. So I've got my odorless mineral spirits, and I decided to go with the transparent red ochre. So I'm going to take my palette knife. I started to dip in it with the brush, but I don't actually ever do that. I'm going to move this camera just a little bit forward so you guys can see the colors a little bit more. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my palette knife and I'm going to scoop up some of this paint, and I'm going to put it over here so I can mix it with the odorless mineral spirits. I'm going to thin it down a little bit. Now you don't want to thin it down too much, but you want it to be nice and loose. And one thing, you don't want it to be runny or drippy on your canvas. Okay, if you have it running or dripping, you probably need to apply more paint. Alright, so I'm going to put this on here. And there's really no rhythm to the madness. You just kind of get the surface covered. I'm having to hold this down right here so that it doesn't slip all over the place. I'm going to grab a little bit more odorless mineral spirits. I'm going to flip this around a little bit. Work with the other side. I'm a right-handed person, so it helps to have the camera on this side so that I'm not in front of the camera. My arm isn't always getting over there, you know, in the way. Okay, so got the surface covered. Now you want to take a paper towel, and if you guys don't know this, if you will buy Viva paper towels, they actually will not leave any lint behind. They're a little bit more expensive, so I always tell my kids when they go to grab the paper towels, don't grab the Vivas. So always have you a roll of Vivas around, and you can take, you know, they come in the select a size shapes also, but I use them as my oil rag. Some of you may have, you know, your husband's t-shirts laying around that, you know, he's not using anymore, or whatever. Those work great too, but if you don't want any lint to be laid on the surface, then Viva works great. We'll also talk about some other things Viva is good for in a little while. Alright, so I've got the surface nice and even, and now I'm ready to, you can let this dry if you want to. Of course it's oil, so it's going to take a little bit longer than acrylics. You can put an underpainting on in acrylics. Some of you like to do that so you can work a little bit quicker, and that's okay too. Alright, so I'm going to, since I'm not letting this dry, I'm working wet into wet today. We're doing alla prima, one sitting. So I'm going to sketch. I've got this pencil liner paintbrush, and I like to get, because I don't have the luxury of Alabama Art Supply right out my back door, I do go to Hobby Lobby occasionally, and they have the Robert Simmons paintbrushes, and I like this paintbrush. These are the hog hair bristles. They last a long time, and they'll take some good wear and tear. Now I'm going to sketch out my shapes onto here, and then I'm going to start putting in my value sets, okay? So I want to think about my rule of thirds, of course. If you don't know about the rule of thirds, I would recommend getting a class on that or reading up on it. But basically, I'm sectioning this off like it's a tic-tac-toe pattern. If you were to think about your canvas in a tic-tac-toe pattern, this is a Q-tip, by the way, that I'm kind of, you can draw in with Q-tips also. They also have those paint erasers that you can use. They have I got this at Alabama Art Supply also. It's a little rubber tip, and they're great for drawing things into the canvas. They will actually remove paint, so I like to get these little things here. But basically you want your tic-tac-toe pattern on your canvas to get your rule of thirds. So if I were to finish that thought here, we're drawing our tic-tac-toe pattern. You really want to divide your canvas into equal proportions. So you'd have to measure it out and mark it. But this would be one of my rule of thirds. This is going to be where my focal point would be. So that would be one. This could be one, this one, or this one. Now, of course, these are rules that you can always break if your painting does not need this. So it's up to you as the artist. But for my photograph, when I photographed it, I was always thinking about my rule of thirds. And this area right here is my focal point area, and that is where I want this relationship to be, okay, in this area here. So, and I showed you where I kind of want my focal point area, which is, you know, right in here. Get a little bit of paint on my brush. Okay, so what if you're a painter and you're not up on your drawing skills, then I would suggest you practice your drawing skills, get some lessons, do something, but it'll help your painting so much more. But if you're not a drawer and you want to just paint, that's okay too. But what I can tell you, there are some easy ways to get your drawing a little better. What I like to do is I like to use reference points all along the edges of my photograph. Okay, so in other words, this point to the top of these trees is not in the middle. Okay, the middle is somewhere around here, but it's a little bit below the middle and not quite 3/4 of the way down. So you can mark that point on your canvas. So if this is the middle here, if I come a little bit below the middle, I want my tree line to start there. Okay, and then if I go down here and around, then I've got this hump of trees and then this hump of trees, and they intersect somewhere about here, which is not the middle of this point, right? But somewhere closer to 1/4 of the way to this edge. So I can mark my canvas here, and that's where those 2 points meet. Then I can look right here, there's just a little bit of an edge there, so I want to mark that. So this will give you a better idea of where your tree lines should end and begin, and where they intersect, and how much space on your canvas they're going to take up. So I'm going to draw this tree line. Now you can be wavy about it or whatever, but I just want to draw in that shape right there, okay? Because I'm just going to fill it in, and I'm going to draw this shape. So I'm going to take a larger brush, and this is my darkest value, okay, meaning it's darker than my sky. So I'm going to start to block in this shape. And I'm telling myself this is where my trees are going to be. Now at this point I am not worried about any leaves or limbs or any of those kind of fussy details, okay? I am just trying to make that value darker. Okay, so now I want to put in my power pole, and again I can decide how far in it is from the edge of my canvas. So I'm going to come in a little ways from the edge and go upwards to my focal point, and this is actually leaning just a slight bit, so I want to lean it also on my canvas. All right, so that's where my power pole is going to be. All right, now I want to put in these 2 parts right here, and if I don't get them right away, I don't have to fuss around too much with it, because this is oils, and you know the oil is going to stay wet for a while. So those of you that are worried about getting things properly placed on your canvas, spend most of your time doing this process, because when you go to put color on, you're having to fix your drawing. You know, if you have this part of it done first, then you don't have to worry about fixing your drawing later. Okay, now I want to kind of mark where these lines are going to be, but I also want to mark in where my clouds are going to be. Okay, so let's talk about the clouds for a minute. These are my lightest value. So one of the things I can do is I can erase paint, right, with a Q-tip. Okay, that's going to remove some of the paint, and I can also add paint back with a paintbrush. So I don't want to worry too much about these values being exactly perfect the first time around. So think of this monochromatic painting as your pencil drawing. With your pencil drawing, you can erase, correct? And then you can always add more graphite. So this process can be a lot of fun in making a little drawing. And you can let it dry overnight and then paint over on top of it. And your drawing base is still there. All right, so first I want to do is I want to sketch out where my cloud shapes are going to be. So I'm going to look again at the edges. I'm going to decide where this is. If I look at this point versus that point, they're not quite lined up. So I want it to come back from that point a little bit. So I'll start it there, okay, and then I can loop it around as it is here, and then bring up this point here. And if you want to divert from the photograph, of course you always have that luxury. And then I'm going to come down here and draw this cloud shape. Okay, so I drew this line of clouds, this line of clouds, and this one here. All right, and as you see, they're not perfectly drawn or anything like that, but I indicated where they are supposed to be. So now I'm going to darken this value of the clouds by putting in more paint. I already had some paint on my paintbrush. Okay, and then I want to darken this, but I also want to indicate that it's part of the cloud, so I don't want it quite as dark as my sky. So there's a little bit of back and forth that needs to happen here. Same thing here, a little bit of color added here. Now I'm encroaching on my darker shapes, so I want to leave a little space so I know where I'm supposed to be. Now I can take my paper towel and go back in and start correcting some things. So think about your paper towel as your eraser. And it also will smooth things out for you. So I'm going to soften some of this and some of this. And some of you may actually be a whole lot better at doing this with brushwork. And if you are, then I would recommend you doing that. It took me a long time to get subtle with my brushwork, so this is just kind of the method. This is called the wipeout method. This is just kind of the method that I became used to, and it's certainly not something that you have to do. But if it makes you more comfortable, I would say grab onto it, because it's a fun way to get into your painting and see some things happening that maybe you weren't seeing before with a brush. Alright, so now I'm going to go in and I'm going to start lightening up some of these areas where my cloud is really light, removing a lot of that paint, and just trying to shape up these clouds a little bit. Alright, and then I can take my brush and I can darken some of this transparent red ochre with a little bit of this blue. And when I say a little, I mean a little. It goes a long way. It gets it pretty dark, okay? So, you know, my trees are pretty dark in here, and so is my power pole. But as it goes up into the sky, it's actually getting lighter. So I want all this down here to be darker than what's going on up here. So I'm going to darken this tree line. And I'm going to leave the pole separated just so I can see where that's going to be. And again, you can always correct this with a paper towel. You can always add or take away paint. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to draw in these lines. You really, when you're working wet into wet, you want to save these for last. But you also want some kind of guide as to where these things are supposed to be. When you're painting, it'll help map things out for you. So I'm going to go ahead and lay these in really loosely with a little bit of paint. This is laying in a little bit darker than I want, but that's okay. I'm going to show you a tip for that in just a moment. And all these little lines are things that are going to lead you back into the painting. I'm going to take this Q-tip. I wasn't supposed to go up this far, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit. It's actually supposed to go to here. Leading lines. Leading lines are things that lead your eye into the focal point. And as you see, all these lines, these power lines will do that. So that's why I found this subject matter so interesting, because if you line up your focal point, then you can use these lines, these power lines, as leading lines into that focal area. Alright, these lines are definitely not supposed to be this dark, but we're going to lay them in anyway. And as you see, I'm not being perfect with them. I'm not trying to fuss over them too much. I'm going to go ahead and darken this up a little. And the reason I'm not is because I kind of like this freer, looser style. It just makes for a much more interesting painting than one that has been fussed over. Okay, so I've got all my major lines in. There are more in there, but I don't want to do all of them. Okay, so the ones that are too dark, what you can do, remember those Viva paper towels? Well, you can go back to those and you can cut them off into little sections, tear them off. And I like to blot my paint with that. Okay, you might have to press down a good bit. There was some that got on my paper towel. It didn't pull up quite as much as I wanted to, but what it's doing is at least flattening out the paint so that when I go over it with other paint, it's not really contaminating or picking it up. So you can continue to do this as much or as little as you want. And there are two sides to the Viva, by the way. The side that you pull off from the roll is going to have more fibers to it. This side that's on the front of the roll, what I call the front of the roll, this is the side that I want to smooth things with. If I want to pick paint up, I'll use the back side. The front side I use for smoothing. I know that seems like a silly little thing to know, but when you use them as much as I do, it comes in handy. Alright, so I've got this to a pretty good place where I know that I can go ahead and start putting paint on. Now, if you are not comfortable with this stage, I would recommend doing more monochromatic paintings so that you can get used to that value study. And also, you can get them pretty detailed to a pretty detailed drawing state. So you can work on this for hours if you wanted to. Okay, so I'm going to start mixing up some of my paints. I like to pre-mix some of my colors so that I know what I'm using, and it just helps the painting process go a little bit better. Alright, so what I'm going to start with is my darkest color, which is going to be blue and yellow, because I'm going to make a green. Oh, and let me back up a little bit. I forgot to tell you guys about the medium I'm going to be using. So for today, I'm using cold wax, and there are a couple that I can tell you about. This one is Gamblin', and some of you are probably already using this. It's a great product. It comes in a little jar like this, or you can buy it in a big gallon can, but when you open it, it's just a clear wax that comes out. And I'm sorry, it's not clear, it's opaque, but when you mix it with your paints, it doesn't change the color of it at all. And then the other one is Dorland's. I'm actually using Dorland's today, I just like the drying time on it better. There are things that you can add to Gamblin to make it dry quicker. And you can go to their website and there are things there that they'll list. But the Dorland's Wax Medium dries quicker than the Gamblin, and so I don't have to add anything to it, so I actually like to use this one. Alright, and it looks very, very similar. You cannot tell the difference in them at all. Okay, so this is what the wax looks like, and I've got it out on my palette. See there? They recommend mixing about a 30% ratio of the wax to the paint. If you want your paint to be more transparent, I would mix more wax with it. You can mix a ton of wax and it doesn't alter your paint, except that it makes it more transparent with each layer. And oh, and let me tell you this too. If you're going to be working on a canvas, you want to use thin layers of wax. If you don't support it with something, then the wax will crack over time. So if you build up thick layers, you'll want to use wood or something like that. I'm not going to be using a lot of thick paint today, so I'm okay with the amount of wax that I'll be using. Okay, so I'm mixing up my darks, and it is pretty dark, but I want to go ahead and add some of my neutralizer, which is my transparent red ochre, and make sure that it's nice and dark. And I've already added my wax in there. So now I'm going to set this aside, and you guys can see where that is. So I'm going to put that there. And then I'm going to mix in some of my sky colors and my cloud colors. Now, they're all blue with a little bit of yellow in them, but so I don't want to adhere so much to the photograph that it's not an interesting painting. So I'm going to take a little bit of blue and some white and some wax, and let's mix that up and see what the value of that is. And by the way, if you don't know the formula for mixing colors to the color that you need, or back to match the color, then you need to learn this formula, which is HVTS, Harry, Victor, Tom, Sally. It is hue, value, saturation, temperature. You mixed to the hue on the color wheel, so I'm mixing blue, and then I'm mixing to the value. So if I take my photograph, you know, how is the value holding up? Could I use this color, this value of this color here in the sky? No, because see, it's too light. So could I use this maybe here? Yes, it's a little bit closer. Probably can't see that on the camera, but it is getting closer in value to this area here. And then as it goes down, it's actually getting a little bit warmer. Okay, so I'll want to add some warmth to this color. Alright, so now I'm going to take a little bit of white and blue and yellow. I have actually gone ahead and pre-mixed a couple of additional colors. So right now I have a really dark green, and I may have to do something outside of this because it's pretty dark. It's almost, you know, it's pretty black. And then I've got a sky blue. It's not my darkest sky blue, but it is one of the darker colors that I'm going to be using. Then I have a little bit of a greenish hue that's going to be in my sky, a little bit lighter green, and then a little bit lighter blue. And then here I mixed some white, a little touch of red, and a little bit of yellow. And that's going to give me a little bit of warmth in my clouds. Now, these are not the colors that I will only be using in my painting. These just kind of give me a starting point, and they also give me my palette. Now, if I go back to my color study that I did before, and if I did it properly, I would want to match the colors that I was using, that I had decided I was already going to set in my painting. But I've got my photograph I'm using today, and these are really pretty similar to my photo. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little bit of brushwork. So here I'm going to get started with a little bit softer brush and a large brush. So I'm using, this is a synthetic actually, and it's a Master's Touch flat. Now I've already mixed wax in my colors. You can thin the paint with odorless mineral spirits. So I'm just going to wet my brush a little bit just to get some odorless mineral spirits on into the bristles, worked in a little bit, and I'm cleaning them off on the paper towel really quickly just to get out any dampness. Now I'm going to start with this color here. And when I thin it out a little bit, it's a little too blue for me, so I'm going to add some more yellow to it. So now it's a little bit more green. It's very blue in the photograph, so I want to make it back to a little bit bluer, but then a little bit more natural, so I'm going to add a little bit of the transparent red ochre. Now, I have not added any white to this, and I'm afraid that I have to add just a little bit to lighten up the value. The yellow's not quite getting it where I need it to be without warming it up too much. So I'm going to add some white to this. And as I add white, it's looking pretty green, as you can see here. You know, this is nowhere near the color I need it to be, so I got to add some more blue to it. This winter blue-green shade. Adding a little bit more white. And just to let you guys know, when I'm mixing, I always do tell myself, do I need it to be warmer? Do I need it to be cooler? You know, I'm constantly asking myself questions before I add anything else to that mixture. Because if you are just throwing paint in there, you're not really making some educated decisions. Okay, so try to really think about what it is that you're doing with your color mixes. Okay, so now I want to go in and start painting some of this tree line here. And I don't need a whole lot of paint, so I'm going across the surface very lightly in some very geometric style shapes. And this is going to give me kind of a hatched pattern, like when you're thinking about hatch work when you're drawing. This layering effect will allow you to have some of the underpainting show through and also allow you to have some color laid on the surface. That's going to create some optical effects, so it's a really interesting way to work. And plus it doesn't destroy your whole underpainting that you've worked so hard at. So gently, softly laying paint on the surface. It's not a digging down into the surface kind of thing. And you can continue to layer more paint and build it up. Your darkest areas don't need a lot of paint though. Your interest is where a lot of your paint needs to go, so that's going to be in this area. Now I may add more paint to this a little bit later, but for the purposes of moving into the painting, I just want to leave a little bit of this undone. Using the side of my brush, using the tip, using the edges. You want to work paint into all of the bristles of your brush so that you can make these interesting marks and get those nice clean edges up next to the pole. Okay, so I've got my darks laid in. Now I'm going to scoop up this paint and set it to the side so that I can have a working area here. Let's make sure you guys can see that. Okay, so now my next color that I want to go into, one thing you want to do is you want to work colors next to each other. I don't want to jump around from this dark area to the light of my clouds. Okay, the reason being is because you want to see how these relationships develop over time. They'll develop more in a sophisticated way, a more educated way, so you want to make decisions as you move through this painting. So I want to work next to the tree line, which is here in this area here, or in this area, or even in the pole. So let's start with the pole since it's a pretty dark object. I'm going to start with mostly blue and some white and the wax, of course. And if you aren't careful with this blue, you'll contaminate all of your paint. So I would recommend keeping a clean palette knife. So this is pretty true to the hue of the pole. I'm going to add just a little bit of red in there because I want a little bit of warmth, because that warmth is actually going to bring that pole forward and closer to us, and it's going to push that tree line back. Now these are very, very subtle effects, but if you don't know that, your painting will look like you didn't know that. So think about the depth of your painting when you're working. Alright, so got my warmth built up in there, and I'm going to put this on with palette knife. And what I'm doing is I'm working all the paint onto the edge of my palette knife. Okay, if you can see, there's a little bit of paint humped up right there on the edge. That's what I'm going to use. If I lay it down in a bead, I can pick up all that paint on the back edge right there. So I've got a little bit more there. Alright, so I'm going to come along the edge of this and just scrape towards myself, giving short little strokes. And then I want to lighten it up just a little bit. I'm probably working a little bit early into the top part of the pole, but that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and lay it down. I'm laying it down very, very thinly though, so that when I'm working in other paint, it doesn't pick it up too much. I'm going to lay a little bit lighter up here in this area across here. Okay, so I've got the dark areas laid in. Now I want to start working in this cloud. I want to start it with brushwork though, because I want most of my thicker paint to be here in that focal point area. So right now I'm cleaning off my brush. There's going to be quite a bit of mineral spirits in here, so I want to make sure that I get that out. Some of you may switch brushes at this point, and that's okay to do too. Probably more preferred actually. Alright, so I'm going to move this paint out of the way so I have a clean working area. And now I'm going to go into this warmer cloud value and lighter value that's down here. It's less saturated than what's happening here. So I want to make sure I make this color what I like to call dirty. So it's going to have a lot of things in it. Alright, so I'm going to start with this lighter blue color that I made for the sky, and if you look, it's really close to what is going on down here, but it needs some warmth added. So we're going to add a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow, and we're going to work that color until we get it the right value and the right warmth, the right temperature, and the right saturation, because right now it's a little too saturated. We may have to desaturate it a little bit. Okay, so now when I go into here, I can touch my photograph and see how light or dark it is. And if you look, see where I just added that paint? On my side, I can see it's just a little bit lighter. So I want to add a little bit more color to that. So a little bit more yellow, a little bit more red. And I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of this transparent red ochre, because that's going to desaturate it a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to touch my photograph and see how close I am. So I'm still a little too light, so I'm going to go back and add some more of these things to it. I grabbed too much red. I'm going to add a little bit of white to that because I got a little heavy-handed. And don't forget to add your wax to this mixture. Alright, so now I think I'm a little closer to where I need to be. A little too light still. So what I can do is knock it down with a little bit of blue. And it just takes a little pinch. Every little piece that you add is going to push it a little bit further. So don't be afraid to make small little jumps. Okay, so this time I want to take a brush. This time I'm using a sable brush. It's a little bit softer haired. I'm going to get it cleaned. I'm sorry, not cleaned. I'm going to get it wet with some odorless mineral spirits because I haven't used it yet. It just kind of softens up the bristles. Alright, now I'm going to pick up some paint. You want to work the paint into all of your bristles so that you have a good amount of paint to work with. And I'm going to start building up this cloud. Light layers. It's a light, subtle touch. It doesn't have to be heavy-handed. Using the edge of the brush, the sides of the brush. I'm going to pick up some of this blue right here because I want to make the cloud a little bit darker as it's going back close to the tree line. I am leaving some of that power line exposed, but I also want to cover some of it up so that it's not so obviously strong and dark. It will actually have a little atmosphere added to it. Okay, so I've got some of this cloud built up here. Now as I'm going further into this cloud, I want to get lighter. So I can start taking that same blue. I'm going to go a little quicker with this process. I can take that same blue and add a little bit of warmth, which is a color that I've already pre-mixed, and start to build up that cloud. So I'm getting the right value in here, but I need to get a little bit lighter and a little bit warmer. So I'm going to add more white and a little bit more yellow, a little bit more wax. So my puddle here got warmer and darker a little too quick. So what you can do is you can actually separate it and pick up something that's lighter and warmer and take a little bit of that mixture and add to it. So that's why I always pre-mix some of my colors, because I've already got basically a tube of paint that I can use. Okay, so now I'm a little bit closer. I'll show you guys. A little bit closer, but I still need a little bit lighter and a little bit more warmth. So I'm going to take some of this lighter and warmer puddle. Okay, now I'm going to take my brush. I'm going to clean it out. Take a paper towel and get the paint out of it. Pick up some of this lighter color and build in some of this cloud. Light-handed, soft. You don't have to press into the canvas. If your canvas is dipping down, if you're like scraping it across, you're putting too much pressure. It's a light touch. Okay, so now we've got that lighter color built up. And this is basically the block-in. If any of you guys have done color block-ins, this is what a color block-in is. Okay, so next we're going to need to start building in these blue hues that are here. So I can take this same paint puddle that I have and add a little bit of this blue hue to it. And I will be pretty close to what that color is. So rather than building that color back up from scratch, it's already got some of the warmth laid in. It needs to be a little bit darker. You've already got that warmth built in, so you're not starting over with a puddle that has no warmth. It has a little bit of everything. Okay, so now I've got this dark one. You can always hold your color up to your photograph to see how close you are to it. It's probably a little bit closer to this hue. This has got a little bit more blue in it, so we're gonna use this color over here. All right, back to your brush. Make sure you wipe out your paint. Pick up your brush and your paint. If some color picks up from another area, don't worry about that too much. Just leave it where it is. I will show you ways to remedy that. Okay, we're going to stop about there on that one, and we're going to add a little bit of blue. And just to let you guys know, anytime I mix a color, I don't just go right over and put it down and then decide, is that the right color or the wrong color? I always want to go back to my reference, which is my photo, and I want to see how that looks against the photo first. And right now I'm pretty close to the value, but I need to add a little bit of warmth. So I'm going to take a little bit of red and add it to it. Picking up some with the brush. I'm going to lighten up some of this as I go up into this cloud. We're back. Let me add some more color into these clouds over here. So we're still working with this warmer color, just laying in lightly. Just remember, very lightly. I'm going to start working some of it up into this cloud area here. Alright, now I'm going to stop with that part, and I'm going to add a little bit of the light to this area, and then I want to start working some of the dark in, and we're going to be done with our block in. Alright, wiping the paint out of my brush. Trying to keep a little tidier in my little spot over here. Try to keep a tidy area. It actually gives you a little bit of room for your mind. So whenever you're working, take time to clean up a little bit in between. And a lot of times I will tell people, because I work at my home studio, I will tell people, go throw a load of laundry in. It's a good reason to break away from your paint if you do other things rather than just straight painting the whole time. It gives your mind room to breathe a little bit, and you're not so tense and uptight, and you're not trying to strive to finish something. You're actually trying to get it complete and correct. Okay, so now here I just made a, actually I need to put out some more white. I'm making a very light value because this is where my lightest light is going to be, and is where all my focal point is going to be. So I want to start working towards light and warmth up here near in the innards of the power pole. So I'm going to a round, soft brush now, and I'm picking up this light paint. And the reason I'm using this round is because it's really gentle and it will actually lay in the paint very nicely. It just has a much freer flow to it. You see I picked up some of that blue. I don't know if you can see it on there, but it's contaminated my light a little, but that's okay. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I am going to start working some of this light on top of some of these other colors, which can be a little tricky. That's why I got this really soft brush, because it lays very nicely and softly. And I don't know if you can tell or not, but don't try to cover every area with paint. You want to leave some of that underpainting showing, and you just want a soft, subtle touch. I'm picking up some of this warmer blue that I had made a little earlier, and I'm going to work it in between here and off over into this cloud area. All right, working some more of this paint in here. Now I'm starting to do a little too much detail, so I want to stop myself, okay? Because I don't want to get into little small strokes and tiny detail yet. I want to get all the rest of this area covered. Okay, so now I want to go back into, I'm going to clean that off. I'm going to go back into some of this darker blue that is over here in this photograph. And right now my value is pretty close, so I'm okay for maybe working it in here, but then it gets a little bit darker up there. It's actually a little bit lighter in here, so I want to grab some of this green and work it into some of that blue. And I'm going to grab a little bit of wax. Alright, getting my brush again. I want to get back to my bigger brush. Working with a bigger brush, you think more in terms of shapes. Carol and I were just sitting here talking about working broader shapes is always better. You know, getting in loosely and not thinking about detail. So I'm glad that she was here to remind me of that. Alright, now I'm going to grab some of this blue and work it into this green and start working up into my sky a little bit. It's a pretty big jump, but I'm okay with it right now. I'm going to grab some more of this green. Okay, and I'm going to grab some of this blue to darken this up a little bit to work into the darker part of this sky right here. Holding it next to my photograph is pretty green, so I want to add a little bit of warmth to that by adding red. Going back and looking, still needs a little bit more red. I don't know that I'm going to get as close to what I need as in this what's in this photograph, because it probably needs a little ultramarine blue, but because we're using a limited palette, we're going to go with what we created here. I'm going to make it a little bit lighter. Don't try to adhere to a photograph so strictly. You want to deviate from the photograph because you're not trying to create a photograph. You're trying to create a painting. So you want to go with your instincts sometimes and let it just happen. I know I'm being very technical on here. To a certain degree, you have to let emotion start setting in and taking over. That's what art really is about. Okay, so I'm going to stop there with that color. I'm going to add some light, and I'm going to finish off this little part of the cloud, and then we're going to start talking about a little detail. Okay, so now we have, I'm going to hold this up so you guys can see it. Now we have all the shapes being built up in there. Now we can start putting in a little detail. But before I do, what I like to do is I like to take my Viva, and I'm going to kind of soften some of these, what I like to call ridges in the paint. They're basically, they're tall points, you know, where the paint is sticking up a little bit. And what this is going to do is just kind of soften everything. Some of you may be screaming at home right now or gasping for air, but I didn't put enough paint on here to really make a big deal out of this. So see, there's not much paint that's coming off at all. Okay. Alright, so that just kind of softened things. Now I can start taking my palette knife and working in some palette knife strokes, which is going to really pull this forward, give it some dimension, get those details put in. Alright, so one thing I can do with my palette knife is I can start to build up some of this tree that's here. We've got a little bit too much underpainting showing, so I'm going to take some of the green. And I'm going to lighten it with some yellow. That's going to give it a different value, which is going to start to give it some more volume. I'm going to take a little bit of the transparent red ochre and a little bit of the white. I'm actually going to get a little bit more yellow than what's there. Don't forget to add some wax if you are adding more paint. You don't necessarily have to all the time, but you should consider it. Alright, I'm going to work in some tops to these trees right here. I'm using the edge of my palette knife. I'm just building up paint onto the edges, and that way I can work in short strokes or I can work in long strokes. Now, one thing I can do, well, let me tell you this. One thing you can do with the palette knife is you can also pucker it a little bit, so I can push it down into the canvas and then pull it up. It will create texture by doing that, which can be really interesting, especially if you have two colors meeting, or if you want texture, like in an area where you have trees. Another way I like to build texture is if you get enough paint on the surface. I like to take my Vivas. I told you I like Vivas, right? So I like to take the Viva and I like to press it down when there's more paint on the surface, and then pull it up gently, and I'll show you guys a little bit closer up. Let's see if you can see some of that texture on there. And so that's kind of fun to do when you aren't really quite sure that an area is working. It just makes for interesting effects, and you don't even have to adjust the values very much or do too much to the area. Just the texture alone will create some optical effects because light will bounce off of it. And there go my paintbrushes. Light will bounce off of it, and that will create some interesting effects to the viewer. That's why people like palette knife work. It's just all that light is getting in and bouncing back into their eyes. Alright, I'm going to take some of this lighter green cloud color, and I'm going to start to build some of it up, which is mostly in this area here. And do something very similar to what I did with the trees, which is to build up some texture. Now I'm not hitting this everywhere, just so you know. I'm kind of tilting my palette knife at certain angles so that it only grabs the surface in certain ways. I'm going to start adjusting the color a little bit here and there. You don't want to use the same color everywhere. You want to create distance and depth and volume. Still keeping the idea of value intact. That's one of the most important things. And yes, I am covering up some of my power lines, but that's because I don't want them to be just straight lines. All the hard lines that you see right now, I want to start softening them all up, because they're eventually going to lead you to the focal point, but what you don't want are straight hard edges that slam you into the focal point. Hard edges make your eye move fast, and soft edges make your eye move slowly. So again, with the palette knife, I'm not trying to cover every part of the surface. I'm just trying to let the paint grab in certain areas. Just trying to keep in mind my focal point at all times, my values, my temperature, all of those things are key to making the painting work. Alright, I'm going to go into some of the lighter parts of the cloud and the warmer parts. I want to work down in here, so I've got to get pretty light. So let me move some of this paint out of the way, get some more light value put in here, and warmth, and wax. Don't forget your wax. Alright, so I've got it the right temperature, but not the right value, so I'm going to add more white. And maybe a little bit of yellow. Yellow will actually lighten your value also. So you don't always have to use white. I just slung paint on the side of the painting there. Okay. Alright, so now we've got a little bit better desaturated color, cloud color, that we can add in addition to what is already there. Add some to this also. Now I've kind of abandoned my photograph at this point because honestly I like what's going on in here, and if I start to look at my photograph I might get a little confused and say, oh no, I didn't do it just like it was there. So at this point you might want to flip your photograph over and forget it, because now you want to create a painting. The photograph was a good guide for you, and now you can just paint. I got a little bit of that Williamsburg I had set to the side, and see how green it is. So I had gotten that into my paint, so I'm going to move that out of the way, and I want to get back to some warmer, lighter colors. You can also add a little bit of OMS, odorless mineral spirits, if you feel like your paint is getting too stiff for you to move around. That might be a good idea. And it's always a good idea to alternate between brush work and palette knife work. That way your painting doesn't look contrived. If you've ever seen anybody that paints totally with palette knife, which I once did as well, it may look a little not unprofessional, but just not as sophisticated. Okay, so now I'm going to alternate back to brushwork because I want to get some more light into my clouds. I've got to get some clean white paint because my paint got contaminated. Alright, I think we need... Okay, so I went ahead and mixed up some light colors, and I'm going to put in some of this lighter cloud area. So we've got this, which is yellow and white and a little bit of everything else in it because it's a desaturated color. And I'm going to come over here and just top some of these clouds with some of this paint. Now you may find this is a little difficult if you have too much paint and it's still really wet, so you might want to just let it dry or tack down a little. And this could be in as little as a few hours that can happen, so you don't have to wait all day or till the next day. Getting some of this lighter cloud color and just popping it in here around this focal point. You want to lay it in loosely and very thick. And if you notice, when I go out to the outer edges, I don't want to be as light as right in my focal area. So I'm picking up some warmth to add back to my cloud. And if you feel like some of the color, the orange underpainting, is distracting, you can always go back in and touch up some of it with some other color. One last thing, if you want your power poles to come back, you know, if they're not showing enough, then you just want to pick up some more paint and add it back in. Okay, so I think we're going to finish up these little power lines with a little bit of color. So I really want to bring in this one here because it's my largest line. You can either do it with palette knife or you can scrape back down to the paint. You can do that with one of these paint erasers that I was talking about earlier. You know, you can scratch out some of the lines, which I like to do around this area where the lines are tied up. And if you don't like it, you can always paint back over it. It's the nice thing about oils. So I'm just bringing some of them back, not all of them. And if you want some of your paint to cover up some of those orange areas, a lot of times I'll take a palette knife and I'll just start to move the paint around a little bit. So in other words, if you a lot of times if I'm working small, I like to hold the painting in my hand, and what you can do is you can actually smooth some of this paint out so that it's covering up a little bit more of those areas. Now you don't want to push too much paint around, and you don't want to do this everywhere, but you can do this a little bit here and there. And again, you can always add texture by taking the Viva paper towel and adding some more texture that way also. A lot of times I'll pick up paint just on the edge of my palette knife like this. Can you guys see that? A little bit of puddled paint, and you can apply it in very short strokes, very thick, and it makes almost like a mosaic effect, which is kind of fun. And it will also create more detail in the general vicinity that you really wanted the detail to be. Thank you guys for letting me show you how I use a palette knife. I hope that maybe you'll visit my Alisa Koch art page on Facebook. I also have one on Instagram, Alisa Koch Art. I don't currently have a website, but I'm working on that. In the meantime, you can look for any of my free videos that are on Facebook, and I hope that in the future you'll look for my Zoom classes. So if you like my art page, you'll get announcements, and you can also sign up on that Facebook page for my email newsletter where I give you tips and tricks occasionally and send you a list of all the supplies that I typically use. So thank you for having me. I look forward to seeing you.